right, so now to welcome our guest, Robert Burcher, as he discusses his most recent novel, My Summer of Glorious Freedom, John Muir's Saunters Around Southern Ontario in the Summer of 1864. Robert Burcher is a retired newspaper photographer who has had an interest in John Muir for decades. He has been involved with the local John Muir story for the past 30 years. After discovering a plaque in the Epping Lookout in Beaver Valley that honored Muir, he was intrigued and started his research. This led to the joining in the 90s of a group called the Canadian Friends of John Muir in Medford. They worked to discover the cabin and mill site where Muir lived and worked during his tours in Canada. Since 2001, Robert has worked to discover the missing link of how Muir arrived in Medford. It is an incredible forensic style research story following a trail of botanical specimens collected by John Muir in the summer of 1864. So welcome, Robert. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Okay, hello to all those friends and family out there. I can hear somebody still has their microphone unmuted, so I can hear a little buzz in the back. So just check to make sure that you're unmuted. It helps me. And I wanted to say that, yes, a year ago, I got this book published, and then COVID has just been such a problem to get it out. So now that the library here in Thornbury has gone to this format, they decided we could do a Zoom talk, which is good. It's all about getting the information out there. So many people in Canada do not know who John Muir is. Americans know for sure he's an icon of the conservation movement. And so this has been a personal trip for me in this area where I live now for 30 years to publicize this process that John Muir actually lived here. I've been working on the book for 5 years, various aspects of it to get around Southern Ontario and do the research to museums and archives and all of that. So you will get a mix of history, botany, some adventure, and some fairly decent photos, what people are telling me about my book. I've had a few lucky breaks on this. The John Muir organization, the Canadian Friends of John Muir, had a few lucky breaks as well in how this whole process rolled out, and it was a great organization back in the 90s. What I was thinking at one point not too long ago is that I was the youngest member then, and a lot of people are disappearing from the group. Too old, some have died. So I thought it was time for me to write the story also of what happened in Medford with that group who did a lot of research on this story. But at the very end, it comes back to the fact that there's a great amount of humility here, because I've read so much of John Muir and how much that man committed his life to saving wild areas, creating parks, creating the concept of a National Park Service. So, Honorable John Muir. So with that, I'm going to start into my little slideshow presentation here. So this will be the talk about John Muir and his experience in Canada, and then my experience in finding a little bit about Muir. For me, this whole process started when I was hiking in the Beaver Valley, and this is County Road 7 going through Kimberley, if you know the area. And I saw at one point that there was this historical plaque in the conservation area, and it was way at the back of the site. It was hidden behind some trees. It was graffitied. It was really abandoned. And I thought, well, why would they put a plaque way back here? I went and read that plaque, and I was just astounded because nobody had ever told me that John Muir had lived in Medford in this area. So I'll read this plaque to you, so if you can't see it on your computers. So John Muir, 1838 to 1914. He was born in Dunbar, Scotland. This famous naturalist, whose books and articles played a significant role in the early development of the United States National Park Service, emigrated with his family, that would be, he came with his parents and his brothers, to Wisconsin in 1849. Intensely interested in botany and geology, Muir set out in 1864 on a walking tour of Canada West. So this is before Confederation, so Ontario was called Canada West at the time, during which time he traveled much of what is known in Ontario today as the Bruce Trail. His brother Daniel had been employed since the previous year at the rake factory of William Trout and Charles J. And just to clarify, it was rakes that were used in the agricultural business for raking grain that had been cut. And this mill was near Meaford on the Big Head River. So he was working there with his brother. In 1866, Muir returned to the United States, where in later years, he became a leading champion of conservation. And boy, did he become the leader. He started a Sierra Club in 1892, and as of my Google search today, it now has 3.8 million members. And to think that this guy who was living in Meaford has started a club of that kind of immensity. Muir also collaborated with Teddy Roosevelt in 1903, and they talked about the concept of a national park system. And this happened on a weekend of camping in Yosemite. And if you look in behind, you can see one of the major waterfalls there. John Muir had been writing many letters to the president about we need to share more land. So let's get on top of this and let's create parks for the people. And that eventually happened in 1916. In 2016, the US government put out a gold coin, which shows Roosevelt and Muir and Yosemite. So that was the kind of honor that Muir was getting at the end of his life. But I'm more interested in his time that he spent in our area as a young man. This is 1872. He was just about 31 or 32. But when he arrived here in Ontario, he was a young man of 25, born in Scotland, living in Wisconsin. But the Civil War is on, and the family were part of a very strict religious group called the Disciples of Christ. And this was important for them not to be warlike. So his mother actually suggested that the boys head to Canada so they didn't get drafted. So in summer of 1864, Muir got on a train in Wisconsin, and nobody ever really knew where he was in that time period. But from letters home, we know that he was in these several places: Bradford, Hamilton, Niagara Falls, and then eventually ending up in Meaford. That was a picture of Muir that he drew himself in that summer of wandering around. But where he ended up is at this most beautiful little location, Trout Hollow on the Big Head River. And if you were to go there today on this spring day that we're having, this is what you would see: the river in good velocity and the trees just starting to come out. I'm showing this picture now, but I'll tell a little bit more about it later. The actual cabin site is where my cursor is sliding back and forth. So Muir and the other people that lived in this cabin lived on a wonderful south-facing slope overlooking this Big Head River. Just a gorgeous place to spend a lot of time. And you have to understand that Muir had come from a dirt poor farm in Wisconsin where water was always hard to come by. So to see this much water every day was just a joy for him. When he was in the Trout Hollow, he wrote this on a letter back to his family. "We live in a retired and romantic hollow. Our tall, tall forest trees are now alive, and the mingled ocean of blossom and leaves wave and curl and rise in rounded swells further and further away. Freshness and beauty are everywhere. Flowers are born every hour. Living sunlight is poured over all, and everything and creature is glad. Our world is indeed a beautiful one." One of the things you have to know is that John Muir, because of his religious background, had managed to memorize the Bible by the time he was 14 years old. That was the only book that he was exposed to as a child. So you get a lot of his writings have a great sort of biblical kind of sense to them. like I said, if you were to be into Trout Hollow today, you would start to see the spring flowers like this trout lily, which is a photo I took about 2 or 3 years ago. But when Muir was in the Trout Hollow area, he was living in this very rough cabin. And this is a sketch that he drew of where he was living. And you can see the big stumps out in front, you know, lumber sort of cast about, a little shed, which might have been the privy out in front. And also in the very center of the roof line, you'll see a smokestack coming out. And we'll get back to that momentarily. But it was an industrial working site. And if you've ever been to a sawmill, it's not the prettiest place to be. So that's the reality. And Muir was talking about other things when he was there. But this whole story got feet and legs when some letters that John Muir had written back to Medford, to his friend Duncan Sterling in 1866, after he had left from Medford. And these were donated to the museum in Medford, and it caused a great excitement with lots of people that John Muir actually lived here. We have real proof now. And that spawned a group called the Canadian Friends of John Muir. And that was our group class portrait back in 1998. There were school teachers, there was naturalists, there was a few farmers in there. And then there was this guy down in the front with a Hawaiian shirt who was trying to be Jimmy Buffett. What we did that year was he organized a hike into Trout Hollow, opened it up to the public, and we had stations along the way where people could stop and learn about the geology, about the river, about Muir, and about sawmills. So it was a very great time. And then in the afternoon, we were going to have speeches in the Medford Opera House. One of the women that came to be one of the experts, Connie Bresnahan from the University of Alberta, was working on her master's thesis at the time. And she was talking to me as we'd finished the hike that perhaps if we could find the cabin site when I'm here, because it had not been found by that time, this would really help me with my master's. So I said, okay, we got a little bit of time. Let's go see what we can find. And the two of us were crashing through the bush. We stopped at a point where I showed you where the cabin was overlooking the river, and there was a groundhog hole there. And in that groundhog hole debris was this pottery shard. It was about the size of a loonie. And I looked at it and I said, Connie, this is really old. I wonder if this is important. And I then spent the next year trying to figure out what this pottery shard was. I've had some archaeology experience. And I went to various archives and museums, and the Ceramic Museum in Toronto, and they identified it as a teacup dated to the 1850s. And the interesting thing is the scene that you can see there is a European scene with a very strange mountain behind. Well, it turned out to be Mount Etna and the town of Catania, Sicily. And in 1669, a volcanic eruption happened, and the lava flowed into the town, and half of the town was destroyed. So it's really interesting to think of John Muir, a Scottish boy living in the United States, drinking out of an English teacup, looking at an image of Italy from 200 years earlier about a major cataclysmic event that had happened. The owner of the property where Trout Hollow is got so excited about this that he paid to have a archaeological team in there for 2 weeks, and we looked at all of the parts of the property. In this image, you can see Jim Molnar, who's one of the archaeologists, pointing out in the soil level there, and I'll use my cursor, in that whitish area in there, is mortar. And we'd figured out that this was the hearth from the stove or from the chimney where the cabin had been. So we were able to measure out and find exactly the perimeter of the cabin. It was a really great moment. But this is the kind of cabin that Muir would have been living in, just a humble log cabin of the time. And this one is a reproduction that's over at Grey Roots, which is our local county museum. And they've done a really good job of putting old stumps and boulders in front of this because it was never beautiful when people were first breaking the land. When I take groups down into Trout Hollow and we know exactly where the cabin site is, I will have 6 volunteers lie down on the exact place where John Muir would have slept. We knew that there were 6 people living there when he was there. And it becomes a mystical experience for some people. I've had people break into tears when they got to this place. So it is worth a walk into see Trout Hollow. We always knew where the mill site was in Trout Hollow because there's an earthworks left there, which is the original dam. But this is what the mill probably would have looked like in size. This is actually a reproduction from, I believe it's Yosemite. So it would have been a basic post and beam construction. And once again, that same group of people are outlining where the mill site was in Trout Hollow. And if you look at the size of the trees there, this is the amazing thing about nature, is that this industrial site of a sawmill and buildings has come back. So those trees are now at least 150 years old. It's kind of a beautiful site now. And it's even with the John Muir overlay, it's even better. When you go down into the mill site, there's a big plaque there talking about the mill. And out in front, I have a yellow line there showing the height of the dam. So the dam was about that height. And there was a big pipe that came from this area right down to where we're standing. And that would have been the intake of water for the mill. This is what the mill would have looked like. This is a mill that operates a water-powered mill south of Owen Sound. And it would have been an overshot wheel, as they call it, of 2 stories construction. And the inside of the mill would be very functional, but very rough. And one of the things that we know about John Muir is that he was an incredible inventor. And he was able, in the second year of his time at Trout Hollow, he got a contract with the owners to improve the mill. He actually doubled the production of this mill. And the work that he was doing, which was making handles for rakes and that, were stored in the attic. The sad thing was that in 1866, February, a major winter storm came through, whistling through this area. And here's a map showing the area from that time period. And if you can see my cursor moving, that's where we found the cabin. The mill was down here, and there's the little mill pond, which was just sort of beside the river. But the theory is that sparks from the cabin were launched through the air. This is about maybe 200 feet, and landed on the roof of the sawmill and burnt it down. So that was the end of John Muir's time in Trout Hollow, and he left and went back to the United States. This map was found after the kerfuffle of Y2K, and it was really quite ironic that after we had argued and worked and done the archaeology on this site, that the township presented us with this map from 1859. It was like cheating, like to go to the back of your physics textbook in high school and get the answer. So that was the end of John Muir's time. I'm just going to do a bit of an adjustment here on my screens. Take a sip of water. So after we'd done all that work with the Canadian Friends of John Muir, everything sort of went quiet. The group basically disbanded. The leftover money was used to make those plaques that are now installed down on the floor of the valley. But in 2016, I got a call from a museum over in Southampton, the Bruce County Museum, and they wanted me to do a talk to talk about John Muir and national parks, because this was the 100th year of the National Park Service in the USA. So I said, sure, but I'll have to do a little research to come up to speed and all of that. And what had happened is that in the meantime, in 2008, a woman who was the archivist for the Sierra Club down in Yosemite, her name is Bonnie Gazelle, published this book, which was all of the botanical specimens that Muir had collected over his lifetime. And she had gone around to herbariums all over the United States to find these different specimens. They'd been scanned and then cleaned up, and you can sort of see there on the cover of the book how beautiful they look. And what came out of that book was the fact that John Muir had done 3 years of university before he came to Canada. So he'd been studying botany at the University of Wisconsin. And this was only like 5 years after Darwin had done The Origin of Species, and all of the other mid-1800 great scientists were just alive and doing things. So Muir had come into this time period and he was just ripe for the learning. He traveled with a plant press, and down there on the ground is a photo of a plant press. So what people were doing at the time was picking plants and pressing them and making collections. So what we had with Muir was that he was sending these images back home, or not images, he was actually sending the plants back home for keepsakes. And this is what the plants would look like after 155 years. So on the left is goldenrod, and on the right is what's called the Canadian violet. But the important thing is that down in the bottom here, he would put the name of the plant, and he would also have the location and the date that it was found upon. So I said, this answers my question. I know where Muir was in that summer of 1864, because I can read his route, but it's like following a stolen credit card where it's been used around the province. So what came out of it is that in the spring of 1864, Muir was based at a farm in Bradford, and he wandered west through the Hockley Valley and back. We don't know exactly where it was because at that time there weren't a lot of roads. So he was doing a lot of bushwhacking, as we call it. And he would just say Simcoe County, Grey County, whatever county he was in for the plant specimens. But I could see the dates. And I also got into the botany of this. My father had been a botanist, graduated in botany from university. So this sort of came to me naturally. So in the spring of 1864, he found, and the summer, I guess, he found 80 different plants between Bradford and through the Hockley Valley. So it was a very good time. But I had to go down and find this place where he'd been living in Bradford. And there's an incredible history about this, is that there was at that time a Scottish community that was based around this church on one of the side roads. This group of Scots had been sort of pushed off the land in Scotland, but the landlord bought them passage to Canada. This is in the early 1800s. And they had been dropped off at the edge of Hudson's Bay. And it was winter coming on. So they spent their first winter at the edge of Hudson's Bay. When the snow was good enough to travel on, they hiked across on snowshoes to the top of Lake Winnipeg. When the ice melted, they were able to paddle down the lake to what was the Red River Colony. And they expected to have land laid out for them, or farms. There was a war going on between the fur companies, and the Métis people and the natives of the time did not want any more whites coming in. So these Scottish people said, we're out of here. And they got into canoes and they paddled from Winnipeg through the Great Lakes and down onto Georgian Bay and into Lake Simcoe, and ended up in this place called Bradford. They got land, and boy, oh boy, did they win the big lottery. They got farms that are some of the best land in Simcoe County and probably some of the best land in Ontario. And this is the particular Campbell farm where John Muir was living. You can just see a little bit of the current farmhouse right there. And one of the descendants of the Campbells who took care of John Muir, I was able to meet in the last few years. And she's actually listening in to the slideshow presentation tonight. So hi, Anne in Bradford. Moving along though, at the edge of the farm, or maybe 2 kilometers south, is the Holland Marsh. And John Muir was into searching into swamps to find rare plants. And when he was at this area, he found the Calypso Borealis orchid in 1864. This is the image that came out of his preserved plant press. But here is an image I took of what a Calypso Borealis orchid really looks like. It's an amazing little Ontario plant. I don't know how far it spreads across Canada. The whole plant is the size of your thumb. The actual flower that you're seeing here is the size of your thumbnail. And thank goodness for close-up lenses on cameras, because I was able to zoom in and look at the detail on this plant. When Muir found this plant, which he had heard about, he was lying on his stomach for hours, just in incredulousness about how complex and amazing this is. And what you have to think about is the fact that Muir, who'd grown up as a very religious man, a child, and then has gone to university. So there's a struggle going on in his head between the whole concept of, did God make this, or is this Darwinian thing that I've learned about in school called evolution? Anyhow, if you want to see this plant, you have to go to Tobermory, Ontario, to the national park, take a boat to an outlying island on a particular weekend, in the first weekend in June. And then you have to follow a special trail with a warden, because these plants are so special, you have to be supervised to go and see these plants. Going west from Bradford, you go through the Hockley Valley, and this is a view of the Hockley Valley, and all of us who live in Thornbury, Meaford, would travel through here on Airport Road, or you grace it along the edge of the Highway 10, but also Highway 400 sort of cuts through the area of where John Muir lived at Bradford. What I did with my research on reestablishing this route of Muir through Ontario was try to get to all of the really natural areas that Muir could have possibly visited. And in the Hockley Valley, it still is very poor farmland. It was sandy and gravelly. So a lot of farms have been abandoned and have gone back to nature. So this particular picture I took in the Hockley Valley Provincial Park, which is a little gem of a park. In Muir's talking about his hike through this area, he was awed to discover that most of the people were Northern Irish. So this is only 14 years after the potato famine. And this couple, who have this incredible headstone, husband and wife, one was from Donegal in Northern Ireland, and the other was from County Armagh. So William and Elizabeth did well. But when they arrived, they had no money. There was no currency. There wasn't even coins or bills to share around. There was no close neighbors to talk to. So when a man like John Muir shows up at your door looking for food and a night's accommodation in exchange for a day's work, they would welcome him in, because Muir, born in Scotland, traveled across the ocean, he's been living in the United States, he's gone to university, he knows all about the Civil War and the politics that are going on. He was a one-man entertainment show. And they said that people wouldn't want him to leave, and especially because he'd grown up on a farm and was an incredible worker in the out of doors. In this area of the Hockley Valley, there's one place that I really like. It's called Mono Center, and it's a small village, several houses now. This was the general store at one time, but it's now a restaurant with a wonderful pub in the basement. And this road going through here was a major road between Owen Sound in Toronto, so there was a lot of traffic through here. So at one time, it was a busy place. It's been bypassed by all the major highways, so it's a quiet little village. But across the road is the Monocliffs Provincial Park, And it is a wonderful place to visit. And I'm sure that Muir would have wandered into this area, especially when I found out from some of the people in the museums in the area that there was a site called Jacob's Ladder. And if you recognize it, if you know the escarpment, this is one of those big crevasses that exist in the limestone. But if you remember your biblical stories, Jacob fell asleep one night and had this dream of a ladder going up to heaven with this great, glorious white light coming from heaven. When you go into the base of that crevasse and you turn around and you look back, the daylight is like this blinding white light. So it really is a sense of what they were talking about with Jacob's Ladder. And I saw pictures in the museum of, women in giant big skirts and men in suit and tie standing exactly where this guy is. Lots of beautiful flowers in the area that Muir would have seen. And I took a picture of this one because it's a thistle. And is there anything more appropriate for a Scottish man to find friendly thistles in the area that he's just wandering through? And then for me, there was always the jack-o'-lantern, my favorite plant when I was a child growing up. So that was Muir's travels in the spring of 1864. My feeling is that he went back to the Campbell farm for the harvest season. They'd been so good to him that he probably went back and was just a hired hand and stayed there until the end of the harvest season in late August into September. Then he would have gone to meet his brother Dan down in Dundas or Hamilton. They're side by side, if you don't know the geography down there. Because the rail line from Windsor to Toronto goes right through Dundas, and there's a train station halfway up the escarpment. So these two boys who've come from flatland Wisconsin would have seen this incredible train station where you look out over this valley and to Lake Ontario in one direction, and then there's the escarpment cliff right beside the rail track. So I think they would have talked to each other via mail going back to Wisconsin and say, okay, I'll meet Dan in Dundas at the train station and 1st of September or something like that. So in the fall, Muir would have traveled down the Purple Line, and where the cursor is, that's Trafalgar Road going down to Oakville, and then Dundas is here. He did meet his brother. They collected some plants in Hamilton and then went off to Niagara Falls, which is where the Nine is. And that is, they spent the whole month of September in the Niagara Peninsula. Down there was a bit of an adventure. This is an old Scottish style tavern that was already in existence on the main street of Orangeville. So Muir would have walked by that and felt very comfortable with this kind of construction, but he had no money. He was still, going on his own. Some bread in his pocket and tea bags for his cup of tea. South of Orangeville, I found this particular fern, which is semi-rare. It's called a walking fern. And if you don't know the history of the walking fern, it's a unique plant that this long leaf that goes out actually attaches to the ground out there and starts another plant. So over time, this plant can walk, well, miles, hundreds of miles over thousands of years, 6 inches at a time. Another beautiful plant that I found down on the escarpment, and I have not been able to find the name of this plant, and I will have to get back to you on that, but I call it the plant, the white fireworks plant, because I can just see it just exploding in the sky. But there was one plant that I was unable to find, and I looked for the longest time, and it was this plant listed in his book, or the book about Muir's specimens. It's called the wild Cala lily. And down there on the name tag, it's called it was found in the Devil's Half Acre. And I found that very curious. But he put extra information that this was 40 miles northeast of Hamilton. So measuring it on a map, I figured that it would fall onto the escarpment somewhere around the Forks of the Credit, which is a beautiful little valley south of Orangeville. So I went all over the Forks of the Credit looking for wild calla lilies. But he came to the realization that that area, the Forks of the Credit, is quite rough and rugged. Big boulders have fallen off the escarpment over generations and they get covered with moss. It's absolutely special if you're a naturalist. But if you're a farmer and this is the land that you've got, oh my God, you would call it a half acre of the devil's land. And also in the Forks of the Credit is a little village called Brimstone, and there was a lime kiln there. And further up on the hill up here where the cursor is, there was something called the Devil's Pulpit. So if there's going to be any place where you could find the Devil's half acre, it would be here in the Forks of the Credit. I never did find that lily, even though I looked and looked and looked and it up and down various creeks into ponds. I had a few close calls where I could have been drowned, but we'll not talk about that here. When you go south on the Bruce Trail out of Brimstone, you can actually get to a side trail that takes you into this industrial lime kiln. And it's very interesting to go in and see something like this that is all taken over once again by nature. I have a great respect for nature, knowing that it can go into an industrial site like this or the sawmill site in Trout Hollow and green it up. But the good news is, a year ago, after my book was published, I was delivering it to a friend in Grand Valley. And he said, Robert, the wild callas are blooming right now, and I'll give you a map of where you can find one. So I drove about 1 kilometer away, and after all of my escapades and almost drowning, I drove up a little gravel road, and I could see from my car the calla lily in the ditch, and that's how close it was to the edge of the road. So I did find the lily that John Muir had found in the Devil's Half Acre. A little bit further south on the escarpment, you'll get to what are called the Cheltenham Badlands, and that's where the erosion has created the Badlands, which would be like out in Alberta. And I checked into that as far as being a half acre, the Devil's Half Acre. But in deeper research, I found that it was really just bad farming practices back in the early times that had skimmed off the topsoil and allowed the land to erode. So I carried on. And as I told you, Trafalgar Road is the most likely road that Muir traveled south because it was one of the early settlement roads, starting in Oakville and heading north as far as Highway 9, if you know that area. And a little secret for all of you in the Thornbury, Meaford area, that if you're driving south, it is the most wonderful road that avoids most of the traffic in the Golden Horseshoe area, and it plops you right down into downtown Oakville. Beautiful road that Muir would have traveled down. And as you go down through all of these little villages along the escarpment, these were all mill towns, and there's many, many brick buildings that date to the early and mid 1800s. And in most of the places, they have been preserved for restaurants and for taverns. So I had an ability to find all of these historic buildings, and I had to go inside and check them out, as you can well imagine. Now I've thrown this image in, which I copied off of a plaque somewhere, because it talks about the transportation of the time, which is basically a stagecoach. And if you had the money, you could ride in a stagecoach with a little roof over the top. But as I said earlier, John Muir had no money. So he wasn't spending money on fancy, travel like that. If a farmer came down a road that Muir was on and he's going to town, most likely at those days, they would ask somebody to hop on, and Muir would have traveled along. And he does actually talk about that in a book he wrote after he left Meaford, where he walked from Indiana down to the Gulf of Mexico in Florida. And he talks about traveling with an old guy on a wagon. So I like to think of John Muir as the original hitchhiker in America, and Jack Kerouac is such a has-been. The other thing you can see here is that there is a train coach, and that's fairly new for the time period. And down in front is something else that was very new at the time, which was a bicycle. They were just being invented in the late 1800s. I have a particular feeling about Hamilton and Dundas. I was born there and family roots are there. And so I did a lot of research around the area of Hamilton, and it was interesting to see this image, which you can pull off the internet, this incredible engraving, and you can really get into the fine details of what was going on and how people lived, where they'd have acreages, as you can see, farms right in town to for their horses to graze, I guess, and have their own little vegetable gardens. Because of my affinity to Hamilton, I really wanted to find this particular specimen for myself on a September the 5th, many years after John found his in 1864. So we got down to the area of Dundas, and there's a major horticultural gardens down there called the Royal Botanical Gardens. So I went in and asked them if they could help me, and they said, sure, we've got a whole grove of them in our arboretum. So they drew me a little map on how to get there. And one of the things I just have to show you is that this is the pod from the honey locust. It's just huge. It's about 18 inches long, so it's pretty unmistakable. So I followed the map, got down to the place where I'm supposed to see, walking back and forth on a very hot day. I was disgruntled because I'm really pretty good at finding my way with a map. And on this bench was a little stone that said trust. And I picked it up and looked at it, and I flipped it over and it said God on the other side. So trust God. I harumphed some more and put the pebble back down on the bench for somebody else to discover. And I looked down between my feet, and there was one of the honey locust pods on the ground between my feet. So I've learned a little bit about trusting God in this whole story, and maybe that was part of the John Muir input. Anyhow, it turns out this bench was right in the middle of this giant honey locust grove, which is kind of a rare plant for Ontario. It grows in the warmer areas of the Carolinian zone, which is further south in America. But I couldn't see the leaves. I couldn't find any actual pods when I was first looking. So I was really quite surprised when I realized I was right in the middle of this area of honey locust. After that, I found out that the reason it's called the honey locust is that the beans are surrounded by a sweet pulp. And the native people of the last 1,000 years were using this as a currency, as candy. It would be traded. And this exact site where I was sitting turned out to be a native village going back 1,000 years. So I had Muir, I had God, and I had all of the karma of the native community working for me on that day. So it was one of the highlights of my whole trip. But from Hamilton, John and his brother Dan, who he's met up with, head off to Niagara Falls. And this is what Niagara Falls would have looked like in its pristine time. By the time Muir got there, it was already starting to turn into the sort of tacky kind of entertainment place that we know of it as today. But when I went to walk in the footsteps of Muir around Niagara Falls, I thought, I'm going to do what Muir would have done. He would have tried to get as close to the water as possible, the edge of the falls, and then he would have climbed down the gorge and got under the falls and looked up, and this is just amazing to see the water falling over Niagara Falls from underneath. The light comes through. It's just absolutely extraordinary. Now, I didn't have to climb down here. There's actually an elevator that goes down after you've paid the $15 entrance fee. But it's roaring, it's wet, and it's gorgeous. I'm sure Muir would have gotten up to this point. He was there for a month. He would have gone up and down this gorge. And remember, this is a guy that spent 3 months as a young child or young teenager digging a well for his father with a hammer and chisel so they could get some, usable water on their farm. And to see this kind of water all at once would have been just unbelievable for John Muir. A little further down from the falls and above the whirlpool, the river is compressed into a gorge, and I had never been there, so I was astonished when I got down there. Once again, another elevator ride down. And there's a boardwalk along the river, and you can see this water racing along with standing waves up to 15 feet high. And the other interesting thing here is that it would probably have been the first time that Muir had got to see the strata that exists underground in the escarpment. And on the sign that got me interested in this, they talked about Muir being interested in botany and geology. So I have no doubt in believing that at some point on this trip, this is where John Muir might have got an insight that multiple things happened underneath the ground. And as I've mentioned a few times, the area around Niagara Falls is in the Carolinian zone. So on the Niagara Peninsula, on this plant, which is the cardinal flower, and it's gorgeous. It stands out like that. It doesn't appear to have any leaves, but it just catches your eye as it grows in sort of the swampy kind of wet areas. So the Muir family lived in Wisconsin at the same latitude that we live at here in Ontario. So around the middle to late September, when they were on the Niagara Peninsula, John and his brother Dan would have said, you know what, we better start figuring out what we're going to do for the winter, especially when the sumac starts turning red. Like that's a red flag to, get ready for winter. So I think this is the point where Dan would have said, okay, why don't you come back with me up to Medford? I've got a job there, and they'll probably give you a job as well. So what they would have done is gone back to Hamilton and then gone up, which is a road which is now called Highway 6, and it goes through Guelph and Fergus and Arthur up to Owen Sound, which is just off the map, and then gone around the top of the Tank Range because there was no Highway 26 to get to Medford. And they were going pretty fast. The way you can look at this is that the way they were collecting specimens, it was like grab and go. And one of the towns they would have gone through is Fergus. And if you've been there recently, it looks amazingly like a Scottish town. If John hadn't have been with his brother Dan and heading to Medford, I'm sure that John Muir would have got a job in this very Scottish town of Fergus. And they still have a major Scottish festival there every August. So I just put a plug in for that, for all you Scots out there. Yeah, here's what Medford, this is what Fergus looks like today. Still a really Scottish kind of town. As they went further north, they would have gotten into the colder zones up in the top of the escarpment. And this is just south of Owen Sound, where the larch trees, or some people call them tamarack, turn yellow in the fall. And perhaps they wouldn't have seen these kind of trees before and been intrigued by a coniferous tree that turns yellow and drops its needles every winter. From Owen Sound, they would have hiked across what's called the Shore Road, or the Lakeshore Road, across the top of the Tank Range. And this is where John Muir would have seen Georgian Bay for the very first time, and yet another big body of water. And for those of you who know the area, I'm using a telephoto lens. So that's actually Cape Croker across on the other side there. But from there, they would have quickly walked south around the top of the Cape into Medford, which was a really bustling town. And what was going on during the Civil War was, because there was a great need for food down to fuel the Civil War, especially for the North, that if you could get your grain to a boat at the shore of the Great Lakes, you had boomtown prices that you would get paid for your grain. So one of the reasons why they were working so hard in the sawmill at Trout Hollow was there was this great need to put more land under cultivation. And they were burning the forest, cutting it like crazy just to get it into farmland. And that was the point where John Muir started to really see what we could do to a forest in very short time. For those of you who live locally, you do have to go into the Medford Museum when the COVID restrictions are off. When I went into this museum in 1991, nobody knew anything about John Muir. Now you go into that museum, they have a whole wall of John Muir memorabilia and information, including this is one of the rakes that was made in the mill at Trout Hollow. So it's an artifact that would have John Muir's DNA on it. So it's quite the amazing display. And the reason that this is happening is that Medford is now on the pilgrimage route. There are so many Americans that are showing up to come and see Medford because it's sort of like it's just been discovered that John Muir was actually in Canada and we know where he was. And now they know how he got here as well, thanks to me. After Muir left from Medford, after the sawmill burnt down, and by the way, all of the stock, apparently 30,000 rake handles were stored in the attic of the mill when it burned down. So all of the stock was burnt. There was no money to be had. The Civil War was over and Muir said, I've got to go back to America. So he went back down and got a job in Indianapolis. And when he was there, he got injured in an industrial accident and lost the sight of his eye. So you can imagine John Muir lying in the dark for 6 weeks, apparently, and that's what you did. And the eye tended to heal, and the other eye, which had gone blind in a sympathetic process, came back as well. So he got his sight back, and he said, that's the point where I remembered how beautiful Trout Hollow was, and I'm going to devote my life to saving nature. So those of us who were involved with the Canadian Friends of John Muir really thought that there was a great amount of learning that happened for Muir in his time in the Medford area. After John Muir, after his sight came back, he went down, as I've said earlier, the hike to the Gulf. He wanted to see and get down to the tropics. He got sick with malaria, got better and said, I don't think I like the tropics, and decided to go to California to see this place called Yosemite. And that's what you're looking at now. So this is where John Muir ended up. And this park, which is one of the 2 most visited parks in the United States, was saved by John Muir and the Sierra Club because of the hard work that he did. So that is how John Muir's life sort of evolved from his time in Canada and then afterwards down to the United States. So you will always see these pictures of John Muir as the original environmentalist. And next Thursday is his birthday, so we will be honoring that. I'll probably be hiking into Trout Hollow, say, hey, John, well done. And he was a great writer, and you will see little quotes everywhere. And this is one of my favorite. In every walk with nature, one receives far more than he seeks. So that wraps up my little show, except this is exciting news that I discovered this afternoon, and I'm allowed to share it with you all. The Trout Hollow, which was in private ownership, was donated this year to the Escarpment Biosphere Preserve. So this means that the site will now be open to the public forever. So we have to thank Ron Knight and the Knight family, I don't know how many Knight brothers and cousins there are of Medford, for donating their land to this Escarpment Biosphere Preserve. And as always, we have to do promotion on books. So yes, if you're interested in having a signed copy of my book, email me. It'll cost you $40 for the book and $5 for shipping in Canada and $11 to ship it to the United States. And I also have to put a plug in for my publisher who has prodded me on this project for 5 years. He had a special metal cast which he'll be selling, which he can contact me about. And on one side of the medal, it's John Muir and his image and his lifetime dates. And on the other side is a picture of the Calypso Borealis, and that's my picture, so I'm pretty happy with that. So that's my talk. Thanks for hanging in, and there we go. Okay, thank you all for coming with me, and thank you, John Muir, for all the work that you've done. And when we get rid of COVID, come on up. I do lots of hikes into Trout Hollow, and I'll be glad to go and give Bob Barnett of the Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy a private hike. Thanks and goodbye, everybody.